They laughed when the black janitor asked why his Christmas pay was missing, right there in the hallway, in front of executives who pretended not to hear. One HR manager shrugged and said it was above his level, while the CEO walked past like the man didn't exist. What they didn't know was that this janitor had been watching them for years, cleaning their floors while recording their secrets. That night he quit without a word, and left behind one envelope that would destroy an entire corporation. By morning the CEO would wake up to headlines, and realize the invisible man had just ended everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The 47th floor of Brookmill Corporation never truly slept, even when the lights dimmed and the executives went home to their gated neighborhoods. Long after the elevators stopped carrying tailored suits and polished heels, Terrence Harlan pushed his janitorial cart across Italian marble that reflected wealth like a mirror. He had learned the building's rhythm over 7 winters, memorizing which offices stayed warm after midnight and which conference rooms still smelled of catered meals and entitlement. Terrence moved quietly, not because he lacked presence, but because the world inside Brookmill had trained him to be invisible. The security guards nodded at him without ever learning his name. The senior managers walked past him with phones pressed to their ears, conversations about bonuses and stock options floating through the air as if he were part of the furniture. He existed in the margins of their success, cleaning the evidence of decisions that never included him. December always felt heavier. The building transformed into a monument of excess, decorated with wreaths the size of car tires and a Christmas tree so tall it scraped the mezzanine. Holiday music echoed softly from hidden speakers, curated to sound inclusive while meaning nothing at all. Terrence scrubbed fingerprints off glass walls while overhearing plans for ski trips and Caribbean escapes. He had grown used to this contrast, the way Brookmill celebrated itself while quietly excluding the people who kept it running. In previous years there had at least been a small holiday bonus, a thin envelope handed out by payroll that felt less like generosity and more like a reminder of hierarchy. It was never enough, but it was something. This year there was nothing. Terrence discovered the omission on a Tuesday night, standing alone in the custodial closet with its flickering fluorescent light. His paycheck stub sat folded in his palm, the numbers unmistakable. No holiday pay, no bonus, no explanation. At first he assumed it was an error, the kind that happened when systems were rushed or updated without notice. Brookmill loved automation when it came to cutting costs. He told himself not to assume intent, even as a familiar knot tightened in his chest. Terrence had survived worse assumptions in his life, but as the night went on, the silence around the missing pay grew louder. The truth revealed itself an hour later, uninvited and sharp. Terrence was wiping down the glass outside the executive conference room when voices drifted through the slightly open door. The room glowed with soft lighting and the smell of catered food. Inside, a handful of senior staff lingered after a planning meeting, coats still off, drinks in hand. Terrence hadn't meant to listen, but years of working unseen had taught him that people spoke most honestly when they thought no one was there. One voice, light with amusement, mentioned trimming non-essential expenses before year-end. Another laughed, saying holiday bonuses were wasted on people who didn't contribute to real growth. Then came the line that settled deep and stayed there, spoken casually, without malice in the tone, which somehow made it worse. People like him always expected something extra. Terrence froze, cloth still pressed against the glass. He didn't need clarification. He had heard variations of that phrase his entire life, dressed up in corporate language, or spoken plainly on the street. In Brookmill, it came wrapped in professionalism and passed off as fiscal responsibility. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, just careless, and that was what broke something open inside him. He understood in that moment that the missing pay was not a mistake. It was a decision, deliberate and signed off by people who would never notice his absence, unless the trash overflowed. He finished his shift on autopilot, moving through the building as memories layered over one another. He remembered the night he stayed late to clean after a board celebration that ran past midnight, scrubbing red wine out of white carpet while executives toasted record profits. He remembered finding a crumpled performance review in a trash bin, marked with coded language that always seemed to land harder on black employees. He remembered the way HR smiled politely when he once asked about advancement opportunities, suggesting night classes and patience, as if time alone could overcome a system designed to keep him exactly where he was. Brookmill had never seen him as Terrence Harlan, the man who sent money home to his mother and helped his teenage son with algebra over video calls. They saw a role, a function, a cause. As midnight approached, the building grew quieter, The kind of quiet that felt earned by those who could afford to rest. Terrence returned his cart to the closet and stood there longer than usual, listening to the hum of electricity behind the walls. He thought about the envelope he'd received years ago, when he first started, the employee handbook thick with promises about equity and respect. He had believed it then, or at least wanted to. Over time, belief had given way to observation, and observation had turned into record-keeping. Terrence had learned to pay attention, to notice patterns, to save copies of things others threw away without a second thought, not out of malice, but survival. When you are treated as invisible, you learn to walk. On his way out, Terrence took a different route, one that led past the executive floor. The carpet was thicker there, softer underfoot, absorbing sound. The offices were larger, personalized with framed awards and family photos taken on vacations that cost more than his annual rent. He paused outside Grant Kessler's office, the CEO whose name appeared on every company-wide email about culture and values. Grant's door was closed, his lights off, but his presence lingered in the space, curated and powerful. Terrence felt no anger in that moment, only clarity. Brookmill had made its choice, and so would he. From the inside pocket of his jacket, Terrence pulled out a sealed envelope, heavier than paper should feel. He had prepared it weeks ago, updating it quietly after each shift, each overheard comment, each discarded document that told a story no one intended to tell. The envelope was clean, unmarked except for a single line, written carefully across the front. He slid it into the CEO's mailbox with steady hands, the metal slot clicking softly as it closed. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the empty hallway, final and irreversible. Terrence didn't look back as he headed for the elevator. When the doors closed, he caught his reflection in the mirrored surface, a man tired but unbroken, eyes clear in a way they hadn't been in years. The elevator descended slowly, floor by floor, carrying him away from a place that had taken more than it ever gave. When he stepped into the cold night air outside Brookmill, snow had begun to fall, covering the city in a clean white layer that made everything look honest for a moment. Terrence adjusted his coat and walked toward the bus stop, already a ghost to the building behind him. Above, on the 47th floor, the envelope waited in silence, holding truths that Brookmill had never meant to confront. Truths that would not stay hidden, once discovered. And as the city slept, unaware of the shift that had just begun, one question hung unanswered in the executive suite. What happens when the person everyone ignored finally decides to be seen? Grant Kessler's mornings were routine, sculpted with the precision of a man who believed his time was too valuable to waste. By 6:45 a.m., his private driver pulled to the Brookmill garage. By 7 he was in his office, sipping an espresso brewed by a machine more expensive than the average janitor's monthly salary. His view, 47 floors above street level, offered a sweeping panorama of the skyline, unmarred by the noise of reality. It was a vantage point that suited him, both literally and metaphorically. Grant didn't look down unless he had to, which is why when he found the envelope in his executive mailbox that morning, unbranded, thick, labeled simply, confidential, you forgot who was watching. His first instinct was mild irritation, not curiosity. He opened it with one hand, distracted by his phone in the other. But the first line froze him mid-scroll. I have worked beneath your feet for 7 years. Here's what you never noticed. Grant's brow furrowed. He set the phone down. As his eyes moved down the neatly typed pages, his face drained of color. The letter didn't threaten, it revealed. Each paragraph unpacked the bones buried deep within Brookmill's polished walls. Terrence had chronicled racial bias hidden in hiring algorithms, patterns of termination that overwhelmingly targeted black employees under performance-based exits, and a bonus structure that disproportionately skipped over janitors, security and cafeteria workers, positions filled almost entirely by people of color. Each claim came with a timestamp, a screenshot, a copy of internal memos or discarded drafts found in shredders that never fully did their job. Names were named. Meetings were quoted verbatim. Dates aligned with emails buried in archives, including one where an HR manager casually labeled a black single mother as probably unreliable. Another memo flagged by Terrence showed an executive bypassing a qualified black candidate for a senior position, citing cultural fit while privately recommending someone he golfed with on weekends. Grant turned the page, then another, then another. There were 16 pages. It was meticulous, chillingly professional. No emotion, no commentary, just facts. Terrence hadn't just observed racism. He'd documented the machinery that enabled it. By page 9, Grant's hand began to tremble slightly. He hadn't personally approved all of these incidents, but he'd signed off on the culture that allowed them. He'd sat through meetings where language was sanitized, where outcomes were justified by metrics that quietly excluded. But he'd never seen it laid bare like this. The final paragraph hit like a scalpel. This is not a threat. It's a reminder. You built your empire on people you never saw. Now the world will see you. Attached was a flash drive. Grant inserted it into his laptop with mechanical fingers, already half knowing what would play. Surveillance footage. Grainy, quiet, undeniable. One clip showed two department heads joking in the break room about diversity optics and how hiring too many black employees might hurt the brand's image. Another showed a black intern being left out of a team meeting, while her white peers laughed and made coffee runs together. The sound quality wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. You could feel it. The exclusion, the derision, the smugness of people who never imagined anyone was recording. Grant slammed the laptop shut and stood up too quickly. The chair rolled backward and crashed into the glass wall behind him. He pressed the intercom. Get legal. Now. Within minutes, the general counsel, Margaret Dwyer, arrived looking groggy but alert. She took the printed letter without a word and read the first 2 pages in silence. When she looked up, her expression had changed. Not anger. Fear. Where did you get this? She asked. It was in my mailbox, Grant replied, pacing. No name. No return. I think it's that janitor Terrence something. He's been here for years. Margaret's fingers tapped rapidly across her tablet, pulling up employee records. Her face tightened. Terrence Harlan. He resigned last night. No formal complaint. No confrontation. Just walked out. She paused, squinting at her screen. And we terminated his health insurance at midnight. System sweep of all former employees before the holiday quarter. Grant blinked. He doesn't have coverage? She shook her head slowly. Not anymore. A heavy silence filled the office. Grant stared out the window, but the skyline offered no comfort now. He turned back. What's the exposure? Margaret didn't soften the blow. If this leaks, it's not just bad PR. It's catastrophic. We're looking at racial discrimination, retaliation, hostile work environment, and probably data destruction. There's documentation here we weren't even aware existed. If he goes public, we're finished. Grant's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. A Google alert. Boycott Brook Mill trending on Twitter. He tapped the link. Someone, maybe Terrence, maybe someone else, had already posted a redacted version of the letter, with a caption that read, "He cleaned their floors." Then he cleaned out the truth. The post had over 30,000 shares in under an hour. Attached was a single image, a photo of the executive Christmas party. All white faces, champagne glasses raised, smiles wide. In the background, just barely visible, was Terrence, pushing a cart in the corner, eyes lowered, unseen by everyone in the frame. Grant's stomach twisted. It was over. Not legally. Not yet. But publicly, morally, he had already lost the narrative. Get the crisis team, he said quietly. Prepare a response. Say we're investigating. Say we're listening. But Margaret was still staring at the letter, her face unreadable. What? He asked. She turned the final page toward him. In the bottom corner was a postscript. This letter isn't the only copy. That was the moment Grant realized the war had already started, and he was playing catch-up in a battle he never saw coming. Outside his office, the corridors buzzed with early morning staff, oblivious to the storm gathering just behind the glass. But downstairs, at reception, the front desk clerk was about to open a certified package addressed to the legal department. The sender? Anonymous. Inside was a flash drive, not the same one Grant had received. This one was worse. As Margaret inserts the second flash drive into her laptop, her face goes pale. This footage shows not just discrimination, but cover-up she personally signed off on. Long before Terrence Harlan ever considered himself a whistleblower, he was a man who listened more than he spoke. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. He had learned early in life that when you are a black man in a white corporate space, your silence is both a defense mechanism and a survival strategy. It protected you from misinterpretation, from retaliation, from being labeled angry, or difficult for simply noticing what others refused to admit. Terrence had mastered that silence, and now he was about to weaponize it. For years, the janitor closet had been more than just a place to store cleaning supplies. It had become Terrence's unofficial archive. Hidden in the back, behind the industrial mop bucket and extra rolls of toilet paper, was a locked drawer inside a battered metal file cabinet. It was here that he kept printed emails found in recycle bins, photocopies of HR memos discarded after meetings, and notes scribbled in shorthand on slips of paper. Terrence had developed a habit. When he heard something foul, something that dripped with racism, dressed up as policy, he wrote it down. Not just the words, but the time, the tone, who said it, and where they were standing. It wasn't paranoia. It was preservation. It began innocently, years ago, when a junior executive joked, near the vending machine, that the company's diversity hires were great for the website photos. Terrence had been polishing the tile floor behind a pillar, unseen as usual. He wrote it down that night. Then came the department meeting, where a white intern was promoted over a black temp worker with years of experience. He had the paperwork for that one. He had emptied the trash from that office the same evening. Over time, the scraps became patterns. The patterns became proof. But the real turning point came 2 years ago. On a night when Terrence stayed late to clean the executive suite, after an emergency board meeting, he entered the main conference room and found a folder still sitting on the long mahogany table left behind in the rush. Inside was a printout titled, Racial Sensitivity Audit, Internal Draft, Not for Circulation. It listed findings from a contracted firm that highlighted disproportionate rates of disciplinary actions against black employees, higher turnover rates for employees of color, and an internal survey showing black staff rated their workplace satisfaction at the lowest percentile. But the report was marked with a red pen, too damaging to release. Prepare revised version for P. Terrence knew instantly what that meant. The truth was inconvenient. It would be softened, rewritten, erased. That's when he stopped documenting quietly and started recording intentionally. He bought a small body mic from a secondhand electronics store, the kind used by vloggers and journalists. He wore it beneath his uniform shirt, turned it on before every shift, and let it roll. No confrontations, no staging, just the raw, ugly sounds of what people said when they thought no one who mattered was listening. Over the next few months, Terrence collected audio of offhand racial jokes, biased performance reviews being edited to justify firings, and private conversations about minimizing diversity outreach, because it attracts the vain kind of applicants. He even captured the moment a senior partner referred to the cleaning staff as background noise. Terrence didn't know exactly what he would do with the files back then. He wasn't trying to take down an empire, only protect himself from being gaslit by a system that thrived on plausible deniability. But as the years passed and the racial slights became more shameless, he realized something chilling. Brookmill's culture wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as intended. That clarity hardened into purpose the night he overheard the executives mocking the cancellation of janitor bonuses. That was when he began organizing everything, turning his archive of evidence into a narrative. He reached out anonymously to a digital civil rights platform known for whistleblower protection, Truth Echo, and submitted a redacted version of the letter he'd left for Grant Kessler. They responded within 12 hours. "This is bigger than policy failure," the email said. "It's systemic abuse, wrapped in a clean logo." They asked if he wanted to go public. He hesitated, not out of fear, but because he understood what this would mean. It would become national. His name would be dragged, questioned, distorted. The firm would counterattack with legal firepower. They would call him bitter, disgruntled, dangerous. Terrence didn't flinch. He replied, "I want to tell my story, in my voice. No edits, no filters." The recording took 2 hours. He sat in his small one-bedroom apartment, phone propped against a stack of cleaning solution boxes, and spoke plainly into the mic. His tone never rose. He didn't curse. He didn't exaggerate. He told the truth as it was. He described the humiliation of being passed in the hallway like air, the ache of watching his son ask why they couldn't afford a proper Christmas, the pain of hearing white men talk about him as if he were a bird. He explained how his silence had been mistaken for ignorance, how his presence was treated like furniture, and how the one thing they never gave him, dignity, was the very thing he would now reclaim. Then he laid out the facts, clip by clip, file by file, timestamp by timestamp. Truth Echo uploaded the audio at 1:23 a.m. By sunrise it had spread like fire. The post was titled, "The Janitor's Tapes. What Brookmill Didn't Want You to Hear." It didn't rely on shock value headlines. It didn't need to. The audio did the talking. People heard the chuckles of men joking about too many black faces in marketing. They heard a manager explaining how to fire a black employee without risking HR fallout, by documenting a pattern, whether it was real or not. They heard Terrence's steady narration between clips, connecting the dots like a prosecutor laying out an airtight case. It was unshakable. The internet responded with fury and grief. Within hours, Terrence told the truth was trending on every major platform. Comment sections flooded with stories from other black workers who had endured silent racism hidden in professionalism. "I Am Terrence" became the new digital protest chant. Even mainstream news outlets began picking up the story, splicing audio clips with somber headlines about corporate racism and silent sabotage. But the most unexpected twist came not from the public, but from inside Brookmill itself. A junior analyst named Camille Thornton, who had worked in data strategy for just under a year, posted a cryptic tweet. "I saw the numbers. He's telling the truth. I kept the spreadsheets, and I'm not deleting anything." It took less than 20 minutes for her tweet to go viral. She followed up with a photo, one that showed an internal file titled Q4 Diversity Adjustment, Final Draft. Do not forward. The file was allegedly used to doctor hiring statistics before quarterly board meetings. Brookmill's internal Slack channels exploded in panic. Executives called emergency meetings. Public relations scrambled to draft statements. Legal advisors debated injunctions. But the wave had already crested. By noon, several employees had walked out. A handful of others forwarded Terrence messages of quiet solidarity. Some expressed guilt, saying they had noticed things over the years, but never spoke up. Terrence read every message. He responded to none. He didn't need to. His voice was already everywhere. Just as the firm begins its damage control, a new anonymous account uploads a second, unreleased tape. This time featuring an HR director laughing about how complaints from those people always end up in the trash. By the time the sun rose over Midtown, Brookmill's brand, once a symbol of sleek professionalism and American enterprise, was bleeding out in real time. The overnight leak of Terrence Harlan's voice had already amassed over 3 million plays across platforms, and now it wasn't just activists and whistleblowers retweeting the clips. Verified corporate sponsors were deleting partnership announcements. Tech analysts were issuing public statements distancing themselves. Investor threads were speculating on internal board restructure. And mainstream news anchors, most of whom had never spoken the name Brookmill Corp on air before, were now reading it with measured disdain, under chyron headlines that read, "Systemic Racism in the Shadows of Corporate America." Inside the company, the tension had metastasized into chaos. Every executive group chat was in meltdown mode. Legal was spinning. PR was suffocating under pressure. Grant Kessler, the man whose name once opened doors in Washington, found himself pacing his office like a trapped animal, jaw clenched so tight his molars ached. Margaret Dwyer, Brookmill's general counsel, was now pulling double duty, half crisis management, half personal damage control. After the second anonymous audio upload, featuring an HR director mocking those people and calling formal complaints shredder material, Margaret knew their internal firewall had been breached. What they were dealing with wasn't just one former janitor's revenge. It was a movement, and it was coming from inside. They tried every textbook PR maneuver. A carefully worded internal email, signed by Grant, spoke of deep concern and company-wide audits. An external press release described Terrence's experience as unfortunate, but not reflective of Brookmill's values. But the internet doesn't respond to passive voice and vague apologies. Within minutes, screenshots of Brookmill's diversity statements, juxtaposed against audio clips of racial slurs and cover-up conversations, flooded timelines under the hashtag #BrookmillExposed. The comment sections turned ruthless. Former employees, anonymous staff, even past interns began posting stories, brief, brutal truths, in 240 characters or less. "I was passed over twice by a less qualified white hire. HR said I was too vocal after reporting racial bias. They told me to smile more. They scheduled me on Juneteenth after I asked for the day off. Said inclusivity means working together." Each story chipped away at the pristine glass tower image the company had spent years curating. But the most devastating blow didn't come from inside. It came from someone who had left years ago quietly, after being forced out. At exactly 11:41 a.m., a tweet appeared from a verified account belonging to Aria Dansby, a former senior project manager at Brookmill. Her name was familiar to some, especially within corporate diversity circles. She had once been praised by Forbes for her leadership in product innovation, but after a sudden departure 2 years prior, she'd vanished from the industry without explanation. Until now, her tweet read, "I was the only black woman in my division at Brookmill. I left after they tried to fire me for non-compliance when I refused to falsify diversity data. Terrence is telling the truth. I have receipts. And I'm done being silent." Attached were 3 PDFs. The first was a string of internal emails between Arya and senior leadership. In one, she was instructed to adjust demographic reports before a board presentation. In another, she pushed back, warning that the data suppression could be seen as deliberate manipulation. The final email in the thread was curt and cold. "We'll be reviewing your fit within the company culture. Further pushback may reflect negatively on your performance metrics." The second file contained her official termination letter. It cited vague infractions, including inability to align with strategic direction and communication tone concerns, the same coded language Terrence had highlighted in his recordings. The third file was the most damaging, an internal chat log between 2 department heads discussing her removal. One line read, "She's smart, but she makes things racial when they don't need to be. We need someone easier to manage." It wasn't just confirmation. It was corroboration from the executive level. Arya's documents validated Terrence's claims, not as anomalies, but as symptoms of a practiced culture. Screenshots of her evidence circulated faster than any press release could keep up with. Within the hour, cable news stations were requesting interviews. Advocacy groups began organizing digital campaigns. Employee review sites like Glassdoor and Indeed were flooded with fresh posts, detailing toxic culture and racial microaggressions, often under titles like "They treat you like you're lucky to be tolerated," or "Don't be black and talented, just be quiet." Brookmill's stock began slipping by early afternoon. Not catastrophic yet, but the tremors were undeniable. The investor line stayed jammed as shareholders demanded answers. What they got was silence followed by strategy. A listening session was announced. A committee was promised. Diversity officers, previously ignored, were suddenly being asked to draft talking points. But no initiative could compete with the raw authenticity of what the world was watching unfold online. The moment that brought everything crashing down was a 37-second clip uploaded by Arya the same afternoon. It showed her in a Zoom meeting from her last year at Brookmill, surrounded by white colleagues. She speaks, clearly proposing a plan to address racial disparities in hiring. The response? An awkward silence, followed by a manager smirking and changing the subject to quarterly goals. The clip ends with Arya visibly deflating, her shoulders sinking, her voice trailing off. It was quiet, devastating, unscripted. That moment, more than the data, more than the memos, broke through. It was the look on her face, the exhaustion, the humiliation of being unheard in a space she helped build. The public wasn't just angry. They were grieving with her, mourning how many other Arya Dansbys had been crushed in boardrooms where their excellence was treated like a threat. And behind the scenes, Brookmill's internal hierarchy began to fracture. Several junior staffers threatened to resign if leadership didn't take accountability. Legal flagged possible class action risk. Their insurance provider warned of coverage reevaluation. The board scheduled an emergency closed-door session. Still, none of it could stop what had already begun. The narrative had escaped containment. Grant watched the news from his office window as protesters began gathering outside the building, with homemade signs. One read, "He cleaned your floors, now he's cleaning your legacy." He turned from the window, face taut, breathing shallow. For the first time in his career, he had no strategy, no spin, just a wall of screen captures, recordings, and a growing army of voices demanding reckoning. Then came the phone call. Margaret picked it up. Her face changed. She held the receiver out to Grant. "It's the New York Times. They want to comment on the internal chat logs. They have the whole file, including the racial slur used by the COO. Grant stared at her, unmoving. Margaret's hand shook as she added, almost whispering, "They said if we don't respond within the hour, they're going live." In the next hour, a confidential HR document, meant for internal eyes only, gets leaked by someone inside Brookmill, and it reveals a list of black employees labeled high risk for reputation damage. It was supposed to be just another holiday celebration, an end-of-year tradition wrapped in fake smiles, silk ties, and champagne toasts. But for Terrence Harlan, the 2022 Brookmill Christmas party was not just a night of exclusion. It was the moment the illusion shattered. The invitations had gone out, discreetly. No posters, no all-staff emails, just private calendar links sent to key personnel under the subject line, "Brookmill Executive Holiday Gala. RSVP required." Terrence found out by accident, while vacuuming the corner office of the facilities director. The monitor had been left on, screen unlocked, and there it was, an RSVP tracker, with columns neatly labeled, confirmed tentative, and no invite needed. That last list was long and telling. Mostly maintenance staff, cafeteria workers, night shift security, and with brutal clarity, every black and brown name Terrence recognized. He didn't say anything, not to the others, not even to himself. He just kept walking, dusting the shelf, pretending not to see what he saw. But inside, a coldness settled. It wasn't just exclusion, it was calculation. A decision made by people who wanted a certain kind of party, a certain kind of image, clean, white, marketable. The party itself was held in the Skyview Lounge, a private venue on the top floor of the building, normally reserved for elite clients and board meetings. Terrence wasn't scheduled to work that night, but he came in anyway, unpaid, unnoticed. He wore his uniform, walked the hallways like he belonged, and no one questioned him. No one ever did. He was the perfect ghost. From the edge of the corridor, half concealed behind a pillar near the fire doors, Terrence watched the celebration unfold like a staged performance. The room glowed in golden light, laughter bubbling through the air, like expensive perfume. Waiters carried silver trays, a jazz quartet played near the windows, and under the mistletoe, executives clinked glasses, posed for pictures, and gave performative toasts about team spirit and diversity momentum. But that was the lie, and Terrence knew it. As the hours passed, he saw no black employees, not one, not among the guests, not among the servers. The only faces that looked like his were on the cleaning crew, and even they had been dismissed early, told their services wouldn't be needed tonight due to reduced foot traffic. Terrence had been called a lot of things in his life, but foot traffic was a new kind of dehumanization. He stayed in the shadows unseen, observing the event with a quiet intensity. Then something inside him shifted. He reached into his pocket and pressed the tiny recorder clip to the inside of his jacket. It wasn't planned. It wasn't revenge. It was necessity. A moment too grotesque to let slip into memory. And it didn't take long before the mask slipped. He caught the first soundbite, barely 10 minutes into the recording. Two HR managers chatting over spiked cider, one whispering to the other, "I'm glad we kept it clean this year. No drama, no awkward moments." The other nodded, smirking. "Yeah, no surprise guests. You know how it gets when you mix too many personalities and too many politics." Later, an assistant VP made a joke about how diversity hires would have killed the wine budget. The crowd around him laughed, not nervously, not awkwardly, but freely, comfortably, as if this was normal. Because to them, it was. Terrence kept recording. When the CEO stood to give his speech, Grant Kessler in a tailored tuxedo, arms stretched wide like a performer on stage, he spoke about gratitude, resilience, and company family. "This team," he said, raising his glass, "is the heart and soul of Brookmill. Every one of you represents what makes this company great." Terrence, still hidden, stared at the sea of pale faces, nodding in agreement. He had mopped up blood, puke, and coffee for these people. He had cleared rat traps from the basement, unclogged toilets on Christmas morning, and picked up the shredded drafts of lies they called press statements. But when they toasted "every one of you," he wasn't included. He wasn't even considered. After the speech, Terrence slipped away. He walked the building floor by floor, the recorder still on, narrating softly into it, describing what he saw, what he felt. Not rage, not even hurt, just confirmation that everything he feared about Brookmill wasn't in his head. It was real, manufactured, cultivated behind closed doors and locked-in boxes. Racism, not in slurs, but in spreadsheets, in party invites, in who mattered when the lights came on. When he returned to the janitor's closet that night, he took the flash drive from the recorder and filed it in a plain envelope, labeling it only by date. He didn't know then if he'd ever use it. But something told him, this moment might matter one day. That one day came exactly 12 months later. As the PR team scrambled to control the fallout from Terrence's voice leaks, and Aria Dansby's evidence flooded the media, an anonymous file surfaced online, uploaded through an encrypted account named I Clean Truth. The file contained a 17-minute video, time-stamped, watermarked, and edited only for clarity. It was the 2022 Brookmill Christmas party. Shot from behind a decorative pillar, the footage showed executives laughing, drinking, and toasting to another year of excellence. It captured every exclusionary comment, every dismissive joke, every unspoken rule about who belonged in that room. And then in a close zoom of the crowd, it caught something damning. A whiteboard, placed discreetly near the coat check, listing VIP names for security clearance. The list was only 36 names long. Not a single one was black. It wasn't just speculation anymore. It was visual proof of deliberate exclusion. Pre-selected, pre-approved, racially filtered. The video spread faster than any tweet. News outlets called it the silent party scandal. Activists called it corporate segregation. And in offices across the country, employees of color watched it and nodded, not because they were shocked, but because finally someone had captured it on tape. But the final seconds of the video offered something even more chilling. As the party raged and the CEO posed for a group photo under the glittering lights, a silent figure could be seen walking past the doorway in the background. A janitor, in uniform, head down, shoulders squared, one hand in his coat pocket, recording. Just as the video goes viral, a new message appears on A Clean Truth's account. That wasn't the only party they held. The next footage is worse, and it's from inside the HR diversity retreat. Inside Brookmill, the fear did not arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, like smoke under sealed doors, curling through corridors that had once echoed with confidence. The glass walls still shined, the elevators still chimed, but something essential had cracked. Employees no longer spoke freely in hallways. Emails were reread 3 times before being sent. Executives stopped joking, stopped lingering, stopped trusting. Terrence Harlan's voice had done more than expose racism. It had shattered the illusion of control. And what terrified leadership most was not what had already surfaced, but what had not. His letter had ended with a line no one could shake. He wasn't the only one watching. That single sentence replayed in every boardroom, every private office, every sleepless night. If Terrence had been invisible for 7 years, how many others had been invisible too? Grant Kessler still walked the floors like a man in charge, but the weight in his chest betrayed him. Every greeting felt forced. Every closed door felt like betrayal in progress. He noticed things now that he had never cared to notice before. Conversations stopping when he approached. Assistants avoiding eye contact. IT technicians lingering a second too long near executive offices. The building no longer belonged to him. It felt occupied. Margaret Dwyer, usually unshakable, had abandoned company phones altogether. She used burner devices, avoided digital calendars, and refused to speak candidly in rooms with smart screens. The second flash drive had changed her. She knew now that the rot wasn't limited to a few bad actors. It was documented, archived, and worse, duplicated. Someone had planned this, someone patient. Human resources, once Brookmill's most polished department, collapsed inward. Simone Hartwell locked herself in her office for hours at a time, canceling meetings under the excuse of strategic realignment. Her name had surfaced in 2 separate leaks already, both times in moments she had laughed off discrimination as inconvenience. She told herself the recordings were taken out of context, but context didn't anymore. The internet had decided who she was. More unsettling than public outrage was the internal silence. No one defended her. No one checked in. The people she once controlled were suddenly unreachable. And she realized too late that compliance had never meant loyalty. Executives began turning on each other with quiet brutality. Private messages became evidence. Old decisions resurfaced with new meaning. Meetings devolved into subtle blame shifting, each person trying to distance themselves from policies they had once upheld without hesitation. I wasn't aware of the wording, one said. That came from HR, not legal, another insisted. But denial had no traction anymore. The leaks were precise, terse and devastatingly timed. This was not chaos. It was choreography. Whoever was behind it understood Brookmill better than Brookmill understood itself. Then the tip lines exploded. Some messages were desperate confessions from employees trying to get ahead of exposure. Others were surgical strikes. Attachments, screenshots, full reports long thought buried. One email sent directly to the board's private server contained an unedited 2019 retention review, showing black employees leaving at triple the rate of white staff. The published version had been quietly rewritten. Someone had kept the original. Someone had waited. Grant read the document in silence, his jaw tightening as realization settled in. This was not about Terrence alone. This was about a system that trained people to look away and failed to account for those who didn't. The breaking point came quietly. Board member Theodore Langston arrived early one morning, hoping to avoid the storm. His office was empty, silent, exactly as he had left it, except for the envelope on his desk. No security breach alerts, no signs of forced entry, just his name written cleanly across the front. Inside, a single sheet of paper waited. 4 words. You watched it happen. Beneath them, clipped neatly, was a photograph. Grainy, time-stamped, undeniable. It showed Langston standing near the elevator during the Christmas party, arms crossed, observing as a black maintenance worker was redirected away from the celebration. Langston hadn't said a word. He hadn't intervened. He had simply watched. The envelope didn't accuse him. It didn't threaten him. It reminded him. When Langston showed the photo to Grant, the room went cold. Grant's first instinct was fury. "We have a mole," he said. But Margaret shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. This wasn't one person. This was a network of silence finally finding its voice. Brookmill had taught its employees that survival meant obedience, that speaking up meant isolation. Now that same silence had turned inward, organizing itself against the very people who benefited from it. As if on cue, a security alert flashed across executive dashboards. Someone had attempted to access Brookmill's most restricted archive, the red file. Termination records, suppressed complaints, risk assessments tied directly to race and reputation management. The access request was flagged as internal, no username, no trail, just intent. Seconds later, every executive phone buzzed with the same message from an unknown number. "You're not the ones with backups." The room fell silent. No one asked who sent it. No one needed to. That evening, far from Brookmill's glass tower, a national investigative journalist opened an unmarked package delivered to her apartment. Inside was a USB drive. Written on it in black marker were 6 words that made her inhale sharply. HR Diversity Retreat. Raw footage. Unedited. The reckoning was no longer internal. It was about to become national. The footage from the HR Diversity Retreat detonated like a grenade across newsrooms, forcing Brookmill into a defensive crouch. But even as the world watched the company squirm, a deeper, more sinister truth was about to crawl out from under the pile of corporate ash they tried so hard to keep buried. The retreat footage had confirmed what many suspected, that Brookmill's internal culture didn't just allow racism. It coached around it, excused it, and framed it with enough professional jargon to pass legal review. But what no one expected was what came next: the audit. The 2019 Brookmill Diversity Audit had long been considered a non-event, a corporate formality, a shiny PDF filled with hollow graphs, diversity platitudes, and airbrushed quotes from smiling staff who had long since disappeared. It was designed to please investors, to satisfy compliance officers, to look good in annual reports. It claimed that Brookmill was exceeding industry benchmarks, in equitable hiring and committed to continuous cultural evolution. It became the company's shield. Every time an issue was raised, someone would reference the audit like a Bible. But behind that polished document was a story no one was supposed to see. An independent journalist, Maya Ellison, assigned to cover the retreat footage, began digging into the audit as part of her broader investigation. What she found didn't sit right. The document was too clean, too perfectly curated. It read less like an assessment and more like a sales pitch. So she went looking, not within Brookmill's PR-approved materials but through whispers from former employees. A name kept resurfacing: Martin Groves. He had been Brookmill's director of compliance during the time of the audit, a man known for his rigid suits, tighter language, and a reputation for problem prevention, which often meant burying whatever threatened the image. Groves had resigned suddenly in early 2020, citing family obligations. No questions were asked, no interviews granted, but a leak from inside the firm, shared anonymously through an encrypted drive, led Maya to a series of documents that had never been seen outside legal review. It was the original, unedited audit, and what it revealed was stunning. The actual findings painted a grim picture. Black employees were 2.7 times more likely to face disciplinary action than white colleagues for identical infractions. Internal complaint records showed that grievances filed by employees of color had a 74% lower resolution rate. Promotion rates for white staff outpaced black staff by nearly 3 to 1, despite similar performance scores. These weren't speculations. These were raw, damning metrics. The worst part: every page had Groves's signature at the bottom, acknowledging receipt, approving edits, and authorizing the final doctored version that went public. Maya's report on the whitewashed audit hit national outlets within 48 hours. By the end of the day, a congressional subcommittee had requested formal documentation. Brookmill's legal department, already buried in crisis management, now had to prepare for federal oversight. But the unexpected twist came when forensic analysts reviewing old internal archives discovered a chain of deleted files recovered from a forgotten hard drive in the compliance division's storage server. Among the metadata were tracked changes in the original audit draft, notes, edits, and margin comments from two internal contributors. One was Martin Groves. The other was identified only by a set of initials, T. At first, investigators dismissed it as coincidence. But as they traced archived HR documents and access logs from that period, it became undeniable. Terrence Harlan had been part of the audit preparation process. Not officially, not acknowledged, but his digital fingerprints were there. Proof that he had flagged inconsistencies, questioned the suppression of internal complaint data, and even submitted a memo titled "Diversity Numbers Look Good, but Reality Feels Otherwise." The memo had been quietly discarded. It was never escalated, and Terrence was never mentioned. When the discovery reached Maya's hands, she reached out to Terrence directly. Her voicemail was short. "You were right before anyone knew it. They erased your voice. But not all of it." Terrence didn't answer the first two calls. Not out of hesitation, but because he needed the silence to sit with the weight of what he had just learned. He had once believed he was just a janitor, an invisible man with no power in a world designed to ignore people like him. But now, as the truth stacked higher, it was clear he hadn't just been a witness to Brookmill's rot. He had tried to warn them, and they had buried it. Now the same document they tried to erase was going to resurrect his voice. Back at Brookmill headquarters, the panic shifted from public to prosecutable. Martin Groves, tracked down at a lakeside property in Vermont, was served with a subpoena. His previous statements denying tampering were now under federal scrutiny. Perjury charges were being drafted. His legal team scrambled to pin blame elsewhere, on directives from upper management, on misunderstandings, on process errors. But the version history in the audit files told a different story. Every change was intentional. Every deletion manual. In a boardroom now stripped of confidence, Grant Kessler stared at the printed audit findings in silence. The red ink circled every manipulated line, every falsified percentage. Margaret sat beside him, phone in hand, face pale. "They're not coming for the company anymore," she said quietly. "They're coming for you, for us." And then, without warning, an encrypted message arrived in the inbox of the federal investigator leading the case. No subject line. No sender. Just a secure PDF with the title, "Brookmill, Complaint Log Suppression Record, Internal Use Only." The first name on the list? Terrence Harlan. Filed in 2019. Flagged for review. Marked "No Action Recommended." As the complaint log suppression file goes public, another name appears at the very bottom. One no one expected. A current board member, who is still actively leading Brookmill's diversity initiative. The fall of an empire rarely comes with a single explosion. It comes with cracks thin at first, then splitting wide, until the whole foundation caves under its own weight. For Grant Kessler, the collapse didn't begin in courtrooms or cable news headlines. It began at his front door. At exactly 6:12 a.m., the first protester arrived. A woman in a hooded sweatshirt stood silently across the street from Grant's estate, in the affluent suburb of Milton Grove. She didn't shout. She didn't carry signs. She simply stood there, arms crossed, holding a printed copy of the whitewashed diversity audit, with Grant's signature circled in red. An hour later, she was joined by two more. By noon, there were dozens. That afternoon, local news helicopters hovered above the gated mansion where Grant had once hosted charity galas and networking brunches. Now, the front gate was flanked by cardboard signs reading "He knew, Terrence told the truth. Diversity can't be faked." Cars slowed as they passed. Phones were raised. The protests weren't organized by unions or political groups. They were spontaneous, stitched together by fury, betrayal, and a collective sense that Brookmill wasn't an isolated company, but a symptom of something much larger. Inside the house, Grant sat alone in his study. The curtains were drawn, the television muted, and his phone vibrated constantly with calls he no longer had the stamina to answer. His image had once symbolized aspiration, clean, composed, commanding. But now, every article, every exposé, every viral clip redefined him, not as a leader, but as an architect of modern corporate racism. And the one man he had never noticed, the janitor whose name he couldn't recall without looking it up, had become the symbol of everything Grant had tried to ignore. The legal hits came like a slow-motion avalanche. First, the class action lawsuit filed by 11 former employees, including Arya Dansby, alleging systemic discrimination, unlawful terminations, and manipulated audits. Then the shareholder revolt. A block of Brookmill investors demanded Grant's immediate resignation, citing irreparable reputational harm and executive negligence. The final blow came in a leaked internal memo, published by Truth Echo, showing Grant had directly intervened to suppress Terrence's original complaint from 2019, writing in the margin, "No traction here, move on." Brookmill's board, which once hailed Grant as the company's visionary backbone, began whispering behind glass doors. Loyalty was replaced with liability management. Behind closed doors, a silent coup took shape. The board began taking confidential votes. Emergency policies were passed without his input. He still held the title, but power had already shifted. The whispers reached Grant slowly. One assistant quietly warned him, "They're circling." Another leaked an unsigned resignation draft already prepared with his name on it. But Grant refused to step down. In his mind, this wasn't a fall. It was a misunderstanding. A momentary collapse he could outtalk, outlast. He made appearances, held briefings, paid PR consultants to coach his tone. He posted a video, stone-faced, eyes rehearsed, where he said, "Brookmill will do better. We will listen. We will learn." But the public had stopped listening to him. They were listening to Terrence. What Grant didn't anticipate was how deep the investigation would go. What began as a scandal of culture was now becoming a legal storm with federal teeth. The Department of Justice, responding to mounting public pressure and verified evidence, opened a formal inquiry into Brookmill's federal contracts. This wasn't just about internal bias anymore. This was about government money, taxpayer funds awarded to companies claiming to meet diversity and inclusion requirements. And if Brookmill had faked audits to secure those contracts, the consequences wouldn't be reputational, they'd be criminal. On the third day of the inquiry, a federal subpoena arrived at Brookmill's downtown headquarters. It wasn't just addressed to the company, it listed names. One of them, Terrence Harlan. Grant read the subpoena himself. The paper trembled in his grip. Beneath Terrence's name was a chilling line, "Primary witness with first-hand knowledge of falsified compliance documentation and audit suppression." Terrence was no longer just a whistleblower. He was now the government's central figure in a fraud case that could dismantle Brookmill from the inside out. His name, once absent from every memo and meeting, was now the one that made even the most seasoned legal advisors pause. Grant's breath caught as he realized something more terrifying than guilt. Terrence had already won. Not with lawsuits, not with revenge, but with truth. The kind of truth that no PR firm, no legal spin, no executive distancing could sanitize. The kind of truth that infects legacy like a virus and rewrites it before it's even finished. But the unexpected twist didn't come from federal courtrooms. It came from within. In a confidential boardroom meeting the following morning, one of the longest-standing directors, a man Grant considered an ally, stood up and placed a manila folder on the table. Inside were internal memos Grant had signed personally, authorizing funding cuts to non-core departments right after promising a company-wide diversity reinvestment. The director didn't shout. He simply said, "You used this company to pretend you were something you never were. We can't carry that weight anymore." By the time Grant left the room, his future was no longer in his hands. And just when he thought the damage couldn't go deeper, Margaret Dwyer entered his office with a look he had never seen on her face before. Pity. She handed him a statement from the DOJ's media team. The inquiry was expanding. They were no longer just investigating Brookmill's contracts. They were investigating every company in the federal diversity grant system that had used Brookmill as a model for compliance. Grant's company hadn't just imploded. It had become ground zero for a national investigation. As Brookmill braces for criminal exposure, a confidential DOJ file leaks revealing that Terrence is preparing to testify publicly. Not for money, but to expose a second company tied to Brookmill's racist hiring pipeline. Terrence Harlan sat beneath the warm haze of studio lights, the polished floor beneath him a far cry from the ones he used to scrub. Cameras rolled, silently catching every twitch of his jaw, every breath he took. He was wearing a dark suit, plain, clean-cut, unbranded, buttoned high over his chest as if to shield the years that led him here. The interview chair was nothing fancy, just gray fabric and steel, but this time it didn't feel like background. For the first time in his life, Terrence wasn't being overlooked. He was the story. The anchor across from him, Lila Reese, leaned in slightly. She wasn't theatrical. She didn't need to be. The moment already carried weight. "Mr. Harlan," she asked softly, "what made you start recording?" Terrence didn't blink. He didn't shift in his seat or play to the camera. His voice was steady, shaped by years of swallowing rage and keeping it neatly folded behind silence. "They never saw me," he said, "so I made sure one day they would have no choice." There was no applause, No dramatic music. Just stillness, the kind of quiet that settles in when truth makes a room hold its breath. Terence went on to describe, not with bitterness, but with frightening precision, what it meant to be ignored in plain sight. He recounted the years spent cleaning glass doors he was never allowed to walk through. The hollow greetings, the assumptions, the condescension, the jokes he wasn't meant to hear, but couldn't forget. He spoke not like a man unraveling, but like one finally unfolding. In the days leading up to the interview, public support for Terence had reached an unprecedented level. Protesters had begun carrying his face on signs. College students were writing essays about him. Editorials described him as a silent scalpel, cutting through corporate hypocrisy, but none of it had changed him. Fame didn't sit on him like a trophy. It fit like armor, hard-earned and heavy. When asked if he ever feared retaliation, Terence gave a faint nod, but not for himself. Fear is built into the system. You're taught early on that speaking up costs you everything. Your job, your peace, your dignity. That's how they keep you quiet. Not with threats, but with silence. Clips from the interview hit every platform within minutes. Trending hashtags rotated from outrage to inspiration. Terence was here painted murals in cities he'd never visited. A video edit, where Terence's quiet words were layered over footage of empty offices and silent boardrooms, went viral before the segment even aired in full. But it was the final 3 minutes of the interview that sent shockwaves through every law office and boardroom in the country. Lila leaned closer. "Are you planning legal action, Mr. Harlan?" He waited, then nodded once, slowly. "I'm filing," he said. "Not for money. I'm filing for every black worker they buried beneath policy. For every name erased, every complaint shredded. This isn't just about me. It never was." The broadcast cut to commercial. But the story didn't end there. Brookmill's legal team, watching from a hotel conference room 2 states away, scrambled into crisis mode. They had anticipated lawsuits from former employees, maybe even a wrongful termination claim, or a breach of protocol accusation. But a civil rights lawsuit filed by the very man they ignored for nearly a decade, and made public in front of millions, was something else entirely. The legal implications were staggering. Pattern discrimination, retaliation, racial targeting, fraud in diversity reporting, and suppression of protected complaints. Terence's legal counsel, a small but fiercely principled firm called Redfield and Jones, issued a short but pointed statement within the hour. "Mr. Harlan has reason to believe that systemic racial harm was not only tolerated but encouraged by corporate leadership at Brookmill. His case is not about individual retaliation, but about structural injustice, an injustice experienced by dozens, if not hundreds, under the same roof." For Brookmill, it was a public relations death sentence. Executives who once dismissed Terence as a non-factor now scrambled to protect their own names. Law firms began withdrawing from Brookmill's counsel, citing conflicts of interest. Shareholders threatened litigation. Their insurance provider quietly initiated a review process for potential breach of ethics clauses. And through it all, Terence remained steady. He didn't do interviews for attention. He did one. One was enough. Back in his apartment, away from the lights and noise, Terence stood by the window watching the city pulse. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply stood with the quiet knowledge that something irreversible had been set in motion. Not just against Brookmill, but against every company that had ever weaponized professionalism to disguise prejudice. On his desk sat a single envelope. Inside was the first draft of his court filing, 32 pages long, annotated, focused, fierce. The language was surgical. It named names. It traced patterns. It cited suppressed data, biased policy enforcement, and first-hand accounts collected over years. And then at the very end, it outlined something that no one expected. Not damages, not a financial settlement, a proposal. A call for an independent industry-wide audit of every corporate diversity report that had used Brookmill as a benchmark in the last 5 years. Terence wasn't just suing for justice. He was dismantling the machinery that allowed injustice to thrive. But even as his legal case took form, something darker stirred beneath the surface. An anonymous email sent from a burner domain to a federal investigator claimed that Brookmill wasn't alone. It listed another corporation, Mavex Solutions, a lesser-known firm that had subcontracted through Brookmill's federal programs. The message was brief: same tactics, same lies, same voices buried. You'll find the same fingerprints. Look for the pipeline. Just days before Terence files the lawsuit, a second janitor from Mavex, an older black woman, reaches out anonymously saying, They did to me what they did to him, and I have it all on tape. As Elijah scrolled further down the list, cross-referencing employee IDs with whistleblower names and public testimonies, one entry pulled him to a dead stop. It wasn't the amount that froze him. It was the initials in the exit memo field. AG. He ran it against the growing database of former employees and whistleblowers, and his blood chilled when the system returned the match. Ariel J. Walker. Her name had surfaced once, in a forum post Terrence had archived years ago. A former diversity officer who had disappeared from the Brookmill staff list, abruptly in no formal resignation, no public statements, just vanished. Some had whispered she took a deal. Others believed she died. Rumors swirled about a car accident, depression, suicide. But the record Elijah was staring at told a different story. Ariel's file had been marked special circumstances, Tier 1 asset risk. The payout she received was the highest on the list. 6 figures issued through an offshore fund under a shell consultancy. The reason? Ideological threat to internal order. Relocation recommended. Even more disturbing was the final note scribbled in the margin, scanned in faintly, as if someone had tried to erase it. All communications to be filtered through EC do not involve legal directly. Elijah sat back in his chair, heart thudding. Evelyn Carr, the now acting CEO of Brookmill, and the very same board member who had claimed she never knew about the culture problems Terrence exposed. Yet here was a record suggesting not only had she known, she had managed the silencing of a key employee who tried to warn them years ago. Ariel hadn't disappeared. She'd been erased, bought, buried and reassigned, like a risk to be neutralized. The question now wasn't just what Brookmill had done. It was whether Ariel Walker was still alive, and if she was finally ready to speak. The wind howled through the high walls of Milton Grove, like a warning, bending trees in the same way. Pressure bends pride, slowly at first, then all at once. Outside Grant Kessler's mansion, the crowd had grown from scattered anger to something organized, something rude. Protesters no longer shouted to be heard. They stood in focused silence, holding candles and photographs of former Brookmill employees, whose careers had been crushed under the weight of polite racism. A few held signs not with slogans, but single names: Terrence, Aria, Ariel, names once buried in file drawers, now etched into a national reckoning. Inside the mansion, the mood had turned cavernous. Grant sat at the long dining table, where he once hosted governors and CEOs, now cluttered with open folders, half-empty glasses of bourbon, and legal memos too grim to finish reading. Each one chipped away at his control. The board was meeting without him now. He had been temporarily distanced from executive operations, a phrase crafted to soothe the public and gut his authority in one surgical blow. The golden parachute he once clung to was no longer guaranteed. His exit package had been tied to an ethics clause buried deep in the bylaws, one that now hung over his head like a noose. In one particularly devastating memo, the board's legal counsel cited patterned misconduct, willful ignorance and executive-level suppression of discriminatory activity. Grant had laughed when he first read it. Hollow, bitter. He'd built Brookmill from the ground up, but now the foundation had turned to quicksand, and every step he took dragged him deeper. A text from Margaret Dwyer came late that evening. Short and loaded. Board vote passed. Pack quickly. They're coming with media coverage. For a moment Grant didn't move. Then he stood, walked to the mirror in the hall, and studied the face that stared back. He didn't recognize it. There were no flashbulbs now. No applause. Just a man undone by what he had ignored too long and profited from too easily. As SUVs rolled up to the curb under cover of darkness, board security, not law enforcement, Grant stepped onto his front porch. Cameras captured every second. His hands were empty. No suitcases. No staff to assist. The only thing he carried was the weight of a brand he could no longer protect. The board spokesperson, waiting in the lead vehicle, approached him with a firm, rehearsed tone. You are being removed, under Article 713 of the bylaws. Public-facing statements have been prepared. Your personal assets remain untouched, pending investigation outcomes. You may not return to any Brookmill facility until advised. Grant didn't respond. He nodded once, then walked down the steps like a man whose name was already a cautionary tale. But the world outside hadn't finished with him, because that same night, while cameras zoomed in on his final walk as CEO, Terrence's lawsuit expanded. New plaintiffs joined in. The floodgates had broken. Aria Dansby submitted official testimony. 2 former interns added sworn affidavits detailing